He brought hope and optimism to an entire nation and created an unforgettable legacy. Tonight, a special tribute to a uniquely American president. Happy birthday, Ronald Reagan, next on Larry King Weekend. Good evening. Yesterday marked another great milestone for the man considered one of the most popular American presidents ever. Ronald Reagan celebrated his 87th birthday, and the occasion was marked by two important tributes. President Clinton signed a bill yesterday, to rename Washington National Airport. It is now Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. And a collection of his speeches was released in print. The new book is entitled A Shining City: The Legacy of Ronald Reagan. The former president has Alzheimer's disease and has not been seen in public much recently, but tonight we want to wish Ronald Reagan a happy birthday by paying our own special tribute and examining his legacy. We have a great panel with us. From Sacramento, the former president's daughter, Maureen Reagan. From our Washington bureau, Marlin Fitzwater, White House press secretary the last 2 years of the Reagan administration. In Houston, Texas, James Baker, who held two key positions in the Reagan administration, White House Chief of Staff and Treasury Secretary, and then served as Secretary of State under President Bush. In Washington, Michael Deaver, Deputy House Chief of Staff, the White House Chief of Staff, in the early Reagan years. In Palm Beach, Florida, we're joined by Senator Howard Baker, who served as President Reagan's Chief of Staff from early 1987 until July of '88. And in Washington, Helen Thomas, the White House correspondent for United Press International, considered the dean of the White House press corps. We'll be hearing messages from lots of others throughout the program. Let's start with Maureen in Sacramento. What are your feelings on your dad being 87?
Oh, just wonder. Just wonder. That's the only way I can describe it, Larry, and I sure hope I've inherited his longevity genes.
Does it make you feel older?
About a year.
Of course, we're fortunate to have anybody who has an 87-year-old father has to feel pretty good about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And physically, he's in wonderful shape. It's a really crummy disease, this Alzheimer's, but he's handling it very well. He still has that incredible grace that everybody always loved about him.
Do you get to see him much?
I try to get down there as often as I can. It's a few hundred miles from here, and I try to stay for a couple of days when I go, because I find that the first day that I'm there, he's not quite sure why I'm there, and he doesn't really want me to leave. And the second day, he knows exactly why I'm there, and it's perfectly okay when I go home.
Marlon, you met President Reagan when you were, was it in that time you became his press secretary?
Well, in the early 80s. I went to the White House in 1983 and served as deputy press secretary in some other capacities. So I was there for 6 years.
What do you remember upon first meeting? What struck you about him?
Well, just that he was such a gentle person. The very first meeting I had in the Oval Office, he was giving off some statistics on the recovery from the recession we'd had in '81 and '82. And I thought something was wrong. And I said, Mr. President, I don't think those are the right numbers. And Jim Baker leaned over me and said, I think you better go check your facts. I did, and turns out I was totally wrong, thought I was going to get fired, and the president never said a word about it.
James Baker, was he, frankly, we don't mean to say was, is he smarter than the general impression of him was?
Absolutely, Larry. That was a misperception that persisted for a while, but I want to tell you something. You never put anything over on President Reagan. And here was a man who had some principles that he held very, very strongly, felt very, very strongly. And you made a mistake if you ever went in there and tried to suggest some sort of an action that ran counter to those principles. I don't get to see President Reagan much anymore, very seldom. But I'll tell you, like a lot of other Americans, I really do miss him.
Michael Deaver, what are your thoughts on the airport naming?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm delighted that President Reagan's getting tributes for his contributions. I think it's wonderful. So I'm tickled to death that and the building.
Was the conventional we, as Jim Baker just said, was that wrong about, not being sharp?
Well, I think one of the great things about Ronald Reagan was that he was always underestimated. People always thought he was too old, or he wasn't very intellectual, or he really wasn't going to make it. And even his last speech before that convention, the last convention he spoke to, everybody thought, my God, it's 11 o'clock at night, this poor old guy isn't going to make it, and he knocked a home run. So he was always blessed with the fact that people never gave him the amount of credit that he deserved.
Howard Baker, you said that in this century there was only two great presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, and they were on opposite sides of the political ledger. What was the match?
Well, I think that's true. I think that we had many great presidents in the course of this century, but Franklin Roosevelt led this country through a depression and then through World War II, or essentially through World War II. And Ronald Reagan led us through the Cold War and to ultimate victory, really symbolized by the speech he made at the Brandenburg Gate when he called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. I think Ronald Reagan is perhaps the most presidential person I ever met. And I think Jim Baker's exactly right, or Mike Deaver is, or we all are, when we say that most people, a lot of people, have made a career out of underestimating him. He's a strong personality. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly what he believed, and he knew exactly where he wanted to go. And I think those are very presidential attributes.
We'll be back with more. Helen Thomas, other guests as well. Here's a special birthday wish for the former president from one of his well-known protégés.
Happy birthday, Mr. President. On this, the 48th anniversary of your 39th birthday, I want you to know that you ain't seen nothing yet, because we stand on your shoulders. We share your optimism, your patriotism, and your romantic belief that every American can make a difference. So we hope you and Nancy are having a great day.
We're back. Let's bring Helen Thomas into the equation. Helen, what are your memories mostly of President Reagan at press conferences?
Well, I thought he was always very gracious, even though he knew I was going to try to sock it to him. And I thought that he was always very kind to all of us, even though I know he must have had to really go into a tank to prepare for those news conferences, like an oral PhD with these briefing books size of telephone books, but always gracious, always kind.
Isn't it unusual, Helen, for people who have an agenda or who are considered either right or left to also have the word kindness included around them?
No, it's not unusual, because I think he was that. But what I like about him, I really would like to say, is that as deep as his convictions were in terms of the evil empire, hardline, with the great help of Nancy Reagan, he really did move toward reconciliation, held out the olive branch to Moscow, and I think he moved the world toward peace.
Maureen Reagan, how good a father is he?
He's the best. He's the best. Helen, I also noticed that he got you to continue wearing red dresses at press conferences.
This is very special. Right.
No,
Maureen,
he's
as
the
a
best.
father.
Well, he's the best. He always gave us, especially me, because I guess I was there first, and he didn't have a lot of experience going into that, but he always gave me lots of tether, and, just go on out there and learn for yourself. Oops, I'm sorry, you fell down there. Here, let me help you up a little. Keep going. You can make it.
Marlon, you were with, if I'm correct, you were with President Reagan at his last campaign stop in his last campaign, right?
Well, there were so many great moments from that last campaign in '84.
But didn't something happen in a California shopping center?
Well, there was a shopping center in Southern California that the president always ended up his campaigns, and we were there when it was dusk. It was the last night. We were about ready to call it quits for the election. The president started telling this long story about being in France and visiting the home of a woman who talked about the war and about those big strapping boys from Iowa who'd come to save her and save her country. And the crowd was crying and cheering, and they didn't know what to do with themselves. And I remember Jim Baker turned to me and said, there's only one person in the world who could tell that story and get away with it, and it was Ronald Reagan.
James, Secretary, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Everything, why do we, despite our political leanings, have such fondness for him?
I think most all Americans have real fondness for him, Larry, because he was, in fact, a very kind and generous person. But he made people feel good. You couldn't walk into a room, or you couldn't be in a room and have President Reagan walk in without everybody feeling better. I remember some of the most really bitter and vicious debates among the cabinet and the staff that President Reagan would have to resolve, and he'd make a decision. Everybody would leave the room feeling like he'd been given his due, that he'd been given a full hearing, and nobody really felt put down. He had an uncanny ability to make these hard decisions and have people feel good about him. Let me just say one quick thing about the underestimation, because
Sure.
I heard Mike Deaver and Howard Baker both talking about it. He was underestimated forever, and I remember the campaign in 1980 when the Carter people used to talk about how they wanted to run against Ronald Reagan, this actor from California. Howard will remember this too. The person they really feared in 1980 was Howard Baker. The people they feared were Howard Baker and John Connally. Howard, you probably remember that. So
let me get a break.
He underestimated a lot of people.
Fondly, but
We'll get a break when we come back. The former First Lady, the wonderful Nancy Reagan, will join us. Bob and Elizabeth Dole are special friends of the Reagans. Senator Dole was one of the former president's key allies on Capitol Hill, and Elizabeth, of course, served in his cabinet. Here, a birthday wish from Bob and Elizabeth Dole.
Bob and I join with all Americans in wishing you, Mr. President, a very happy birthday. You know, I have so many warm memories of the years I was privileged to serve in your White House and cabinet as Secretary of Transportation. But there's one memory that stands out above the others. You and I were talking just before you were to deliver a speech, and you told me about the strains you sometimes felt as governor of California. You said, Elizabeth, it seemed each morning began with someone standing before my desk describing yet another crisis. At times, the stress became almost unbearable, and I had the urge to look over my shoulder for someone I could pass the problem to. But then one day I realized I was looking in the wrong direction. I looked up instead of back. I'm still looking up. I don't think I could face one more day in this office if I didn't know I could ask God's help, and it would be given, you said. Grounded in that unshakable faith and with your great vision, Mr. President, you have turned America around and brought hope to millions of men and women around the world for whom freedom had until then been only a dream. Thank you, Mr. President, and God bless you and Nancy.
Mr. President, like Elizabeth, I also had the honor of serving on the front lines of the Reagan Revolution. As Majority Leader, I worked with you to restore our economic, military, and moral strength. You have given our party and our country a living legacy of your unfailing values. My best wishes to you and Nancy, and happy birthday.
Welcome back to our birthday tribute to Ronald Reagan, 87 years old yesterday. Our guests tonight are from Sacramento, the former president's daughter, Maureen Reagan. From our Washington Bureau, former White House Press Secretary Marlin Fitzwater. From Houston, former Secretary of State James Baker, who served the Reagan administration as White House Chief of Staff and Treasury Secretary. In Washington, Michael Deva, Deputy White House Chief of Staff under President Reagan. In Palm Beach, Senator Howard Baker, Ronald Reagan's White House Chief of Staff in 1987 and 88. And in Washington, Helen Thomas, the White House correspondent for United Press International. And gentlemen and ladies, we are now joined on the phone by the former First Lady of the United States. She'll always be a First Lady, Nancy Reagan. Nancy.
Yes, Larry.
How did the president spend his 87th?
He had a party at the office. The staff gave him a party, and then at the library, Jean Kirkpatrick came out and spoke. And at home tonight, we've just had cake and all the fixings. But it's been wonderful to. I can't believe, first of all, that he's 87. It just seems incredible to me. I can't believe that next month we'll be married 46 years. How is that possible when I'm only 35.
I know, having dined a few times with both of you, once at a lunch, he loves sweets.
Yes.
Is that still true?
Oh, yes. It was a big piece of chocolate cake he had tonight.
Nancy, everyone is interested in this president who has down the road become beloved. Can you tell us about the Alzheimer's?
Well, there's nothing really to tell. Everybody knows what Alzheimer's is. It's a cruel disease. It's a terrible disease, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's very difficult, and it's cruel.
He looks so great.
He looks wonderful. He looks wonderful. Yes, he does. And I took pictures tonight, and he'll look wonderful in the pictures.
It must be very tough for you.
Well,
I mean, the caregiver with Alzheimer's has, one would seem, daily problems.
It's not easy, but by the same token, Larry, he would do the same for me if the situation were reversed. So I remember, I keep that in mind.
What does it feel like to be married to someone with an airport named after him?
Well, it's very nice, and I think I told you earlier that the first person to call me about that was Billy Graham, which was so sweet and so nice, and I really, it meant a lot to me, and I appreciated it. And before I get my part gets off, Helen, I want to thank you for those kind words.
I meant them.
Well, you're very kind. And
I think Maureen wants to say something to you too, Nancy.
Hello
Maureen?
there.
Hi, Mermy.
How are you?
I'm fine.
I knew it was chocolate cake.
Oh, yes.
Listen, Dennis handed me a note, and he said that you got a call from Fred Ryan.
Oh, yes. I had a call from Fred Ryan, and a friend of his was flying into Washington today, and as they were approaching the airport, the pilot said, I hope I'm getting this right, the pilot said, I've been with this airline for 17 years, and I've never been filled with such pride as to now be able to say to you, you are now approaching the Ronald Reagan Airport. And with that, everybody in the airplane began to applaud.
All right.
That's wonderful. Nancy, can I hold you a little longer?
Sure.
Okay, because I want the other panel members to get in on this too. So Nancy will remain with us on the phone, and we'll come back with our panel. Here's a birthday wish for President Reagan from Gerald Ford.
Congratulations, Ron, on your 87th birthday anniversary. It's a milestone in a great career in public service. All of us are very, very proud of your outstanding record as governor of the state of California and your fine, fine service and outstanding achievement as president of the United States. All Americans extend, as I do, our very warmest regards on this 87th birthday. Betty and I have many fond memories of our good personal relationship with Nancy and with you. And we also have great recollections of working together with you in the political arena and in service on behalf of our great country. We extend to you the warmest regards and the highest admiration on your 87th birthday anniversary. We wish you many more. God bless you, Ron.
Marlon Fitzwater, Nancy Reagan is still with us. She'll remain with us through this segment. What are your memories about working with her in the White House?
Well, they were very great, and The moment I always remember the most about the First Lady was when she saved Helen Thomas from total annihilation in the town square of Moscow. The KGB were pushing Helen around and she was falling down. Mrs. Reagan actually walked back to Helen, wrapped her arms around her, and carried her to the embassy. I couldn't believe it.
Helen, I guess you remember that.
I do indeed. One of my better moments.
James Baker, your thoughts on these, the birthday wife?
Larry, I probably wouldn't have been in the White House had it not been for the birthday wife.
Really?
She had a lot to do with, I think, with my being selected as Chief of Staff in the first term. I've always been proud of that. Maybe she can fill you in on that in a little more detail than I can.
Nancy, will you?
No.
But I want to. Well, I think she had a little bit to do with it. But anyway, let me mention one thing that I think personifies President Reagan. I remember in 1980, Larry, being in the room with President Reagan in the holding room about 2 or 3 minutes before he was to go out in his only debate with Jimmy Carter. That was the only debate of that campaign. It was 10 days before the campaign. The polls were dead even, and there was a lot at stake. And President Reagan turned to me, Governor Reagan then turned to me, and he said, "Jim, would you excuse me for a minute? I want to have a word or two with the man upstairs." And that made a profound impression upon me, and I think it says a lot about President Reagan.
Michael Diva, you have been and are very close to Nancy for a long period of time, right?
That's right.
And she's going through some very tough things now, but yet she appears, as we hear on the phone, so buoyant. So tell us about her.
Well, I think she's a very good actress. I think she's... I think this may be Nancy's finest hour. I always said about Nancy Reagan, if Ronald Reagan had owned a shoe store, she'd be pushing shoes. She's just... she made his life a dream.
Nancy, we discussed earlier the underestimation of your husband. Why do you think that was?
I don't know why that was, but it started when he was out here when he ran for governor. But it was true then. Pat Brown wanted to run against Ronnie more than George Christopher. Ronnie was, the one, the pushover. Well, he's not a pushover, and he never has been. But I don't know why people thought that about him.
Nancy, was he able to well comprehend the airport naming?
I'm not sure, Larry.
That's the one thing we don't know in Alzheimer's, right?
No.
We don't know what the victim of it takes in.
No.
And that is probably the most frustrating part, isn't it?
Yes, one of them. Listen. Let's get. I'm so to talk to all of my friends from all over the country. You've got them but scattered all over, and it's so wonderful to hear all your voices. I can't tell you. It really is. I miss you all, and I love you all dearly, and that includes you, Helen.
Thank you, Nancy.
In the days when the media is being bashed, that's lovely to hear.
Nancy praises the media. Thanks, Nancy Reagan.
I saved her life as
that's right.
Right?
They were intense adversaries for the presidency back in 1980, but Jimmy Carter had nothing but respect for Ronald Reagan. Here's a birthday greeting from President Carter to his old rival.
Rosa and I join the entire country in wishing you a happy 87th birthday. I know firsthand how you were able to capture the imagination of the American people as president, and how you and Nancy are continuing to inspire people through the Reagan Research Institute. From one retiree to another, I hope you have a wonderful birthday celebration with your family and friends.
Welcome back. This is a special birthday tribute to former President Ronald Reagan. If you just joined us, our guests are in Sacramento, Mr. Reagan's daughter, Maureen Reagan. In our Washington Bureau, Marlon Fitzwater, White House press secretary during Ronald Reagan's last 2 years in office. In Houston, we're joined by James Baker, former Secretary of State, who served as Chief of Staff and Treasury Secretary under President Reagan. In Washington, our guest is Michael Deaver, Mr. Reagan's Deputy White House Chief of Staff in the early years of the administration. In Palm Beach, we have Howard Baker, White House Chief of Staff in 1987 and 88, a distinguished United States Senator. And in Washington, Helen Thomas, White House correspondent for United Press International. We've heard from former presidents, and we have also heard for 2 segments from the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. And now we'll go sweeping around our panel again. Maureen, we talked about your father. What kind of, I guess, stepmother is your mother?
Oh, well, Nancy is a very unique person, and we think it's very important to take care of the caregiver because she does quite a job on a 24-hour basis in taking care of my father. One thing I wanted to say about Alzheimer's, Larry, there are some of us who have a kind of working hypothesis, though we're not medical researchers, that you don't actually lose the memory, you lose the access to it. And so as a result of that, which you were saying earlier, you're never quite sure what they're tapped into at any given time. And it could be that they know exactly what you're saying, and then again, other times that they couldn't. So you have to act on a natural basis with them.
Which is why Nancy said she didn't know how he felt about the naming of the airport because she didn't know if that had connected.
But a week from now, he may bring it up himself. And so you know that it went in. So now, you just don't know.
Senator Baker, we can only imagine then what that would be like to be around all the time. Frustrating when you love someone who may not know you one minute and know you the next.
It's a tough situation for Nancy. And I saw her recently, and I must say it confirmed what I'd known already. That is, she handles this thing not only with grace and dignity, but with care and compassion. She is absolutely remarkable in her care for the president, and I admire so much for that. You know, all during their marriage, I'm sure, but certainly during the time I've known them, which has been since the mid-'60s, they've really been a pair. They've been a team, and she has contributed mightily to his success, to his ability to face difficult times and circumstances and to make difficult decisions. I salute her as well as saluting the president on his birthday.
And Helen, in all fairness, Nancy got a lot of bum raps, especially the first 2 years in Washington, didn't she?
Well, I think she had an image problem, that they thought of her as Rodeo Drive matron who only cared about high fashion in China. And actually, she set out a goal to just take care of her husband. And then I think she realized that once you get to the White House, you've got 10 maids, 10 mops. You can't just sit there, you got to do something. And when she did, with the against drug abuse among youth, then she was off she was marvelous, and I think that then her polls went up and she got a whole grasp, and the nation loved her for it.
Marlon Fitzwater, Hillary is regarded as a stand-up woman in crisis. Nancy was regarded as a hero worshiper. Why the difference?
Well, I think, of course, Mrs. Reagan stood up for the president in so many personal ways. I mean, she was really protective, and this is a little difficult to say knowing she's right here watching, but she was very protective of the president in terms of his health and his reputation and his time, whereas Mrs. Clinton is more involved in policies, and I think people are a little suspicious of Mrs. Clinton wanting to be president, and that was really never an issue with Mrs. Reagan.
James Baker, I don't want to bandy the word around, and I expect a direct answer. Was he a great president?
Was Ronald Reagan a great president?
Great. Now, I'm using the word great. That's Lincoln, Roosevelt, Jefferson.
Well, I'm biased, of course, Larry, but my answer to you would be you bet. He was a two-term Republican president. Dwight Eisenhower is the only other one in recent times that comes to my mind. And I think that Ronald Reagan's legacy is tremendous and is going to be seen as such by historians. I mean, we don't have time to go through the litany here, but it was tremendous when you think about the end of the Cold War and the 7 years of prosperity that he produced coming into office, as he did, with 18% interest rates and that sort of thing. Yeah. So he was a great president, in my opinion. I will admit my bias.
We'll talk about that legacy in a moment. Through the triumph and turmoil of his administration, Ronald Reagan could always count on his second-in-command, the man who succeeded him in the Oval Office. Here is a greeting from the former president and Mrs. George Bush.
Well, it just seems like the other day when we were celebrating that wonderful President Reagan's 70th birthday, dancing at the White House. And that started a wonderful friendship. And we just want you to know that we love the President and we love Nancy. And happy birthday, Mr. President.
And let me just chip in, Larry. One, I think it's wonderful that you're saluting President Reagan. And two, it gives me a chance to say that I love the man. I treasure the friendship that I have with Ronald Reagan. I learned a lot from him about life its own self, about decency, about leadership, and about honor. And Ron, I salute you on this 87th birthday. The Bush family loves you very, very much.
Michael Deaver, true that his respect was such for the Oval Office that Ronald Reagan wouldn't take his jacket off in the Oval Office even if it was like 90 degrees with the air conditioning broke?
That's true. I think we'd only been there about 6 months in July that first year when we had to go out on the South Lawn for some ceremony. And when we came back in, you know, our shirts were sticking to our skin, and I took my jacket off, and he went and sat back down at his desk with his jacket on and began writing. And I said, Mr. President, for God's sakes, take your coat off and cool off. And he looked at me and he said, oh, I couldn't do that in this office. And I don't think he ever did. He would come over on a Saturday with a cowboy shirt or a sweater on, but he never took it off when he was in the Oval Office on business.
Howard Baker, you've been quoted as saying that he was the quintessential president. I get the exact quote here. You said that he is the most presidential man I've ever known. Elaborate.
Well, I think it had to do with his personality as much as anything else, because I place great store and importance on the fact that he understood fully who he was and what he was supposed to do as President of the United States. We've had presidents who never did get used to the idea that they were president, and it showed. But Reagan was perfectly at ease in that office, and he was able to carry on very effectively because of that. He also, forgive the immodesty if it is immodest, but he was also not afraid to have strong people around him. And he knew he was in control of the situation, that he was setting the agenda, but he understood also that in that job he had to have strong people that he could delegate to. And he did that. And I think that's very presidential.
Maureen, he did not, though, like to personally fire people, right?
No, I don't know many people who do, Larry. He definitely
There are some people who enjoy it.
Well, that could be, and I wish we'd had some of them. It might have made things easier a few times. No, he didn't like to. By the way, you know, Mike Deaver and I did a mean Charleston at that 70th birthday party.
That's right, Maureen.
Is that true, Marlon, though, that President Reagan was uncomfortable around job displacement?
Well, sometimes, but you know, there was never any question of him being as tough as he needed to be in the issues that mattered. My favorite impression is always of him in Moscow in the Kremlin in a room that looked like a Fabergé egg. And he and Gorbachev are at the end of the table standing toe-to-toe arguing. Gorbachev shaking his finger in anger and calling him all kinds of names. And the president just said, no, we're not going to return to detente in the 80s. We're not going to give up Star Wars. That's all there is to it. And Gorbachev's shoulders just sank. And you could tell then he realized that the argument was lost, and he looked up, smiled, and put his arm around him and said, let's go meet the press. But the president knew how to be tough when it was necessary.
Why, James Baker, I guess it was from pronouncements, did we think that he was more likely to lead us to conflict than to rapprochement with Russia?
Well, I think that's because when he came in, the perception, and it was a misperception, was that he was a trigger-happy cowboy, and that and because he was so committed to rebuilding America's defenses, and by the way, restoring America's pride, which is something he did, and restoring America's military strength. I think people thought, well, this guy's going to get us in trouble. He's going to go out here and get us in a war without having thought it through. That was totally wrong, of course. And President Reagan was very reasoned in the way he approached anything having to do with the use of military force. I remember the Grenada incident particularly, and we finally went in there, but it wasn't a cowboy operation at all.
We'll be back with more of our panel. We, of course, have not forgotten our current chief executive. A birthday wish from the man who now lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Hillary and I are proud to join with all Americans in wishing you a happy birthday, President Reagan. Your optimism, your patriotism, and your determination to spread America's vision of freedom throughout the world represent the best our nation has to offer. With courage and with your trademark sense of humor, you help to restore all Americans' confidence in America. Happy birthday, Mr. President.
Helen Thomas, we've heard all about the deliberately standing under a helicopter so he couldn't be heard giving an answer. What kind of president was he to cover?
Well, he was very interesting. I mean, we could really count on his vacations. He'd go out to the ranch for 3 weeks, so we knew that we could hit Santa Barbara and take in all the good restaurants. He was very not impromptu. After LBJ and a few others, this was a nice sinecure for us in a sense. I think that it was a very organized White House. There's no question about it.
More organized than this one?
Can I tell my favorite story about President Reagan? When President Reagan went to Moscow, he suddenly discovered that the Russian people laughed and they cried and they were human. And when we came back to Washington, I said, Mr. President, don't you think if you had gone there 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you might have found out that they're happy and they're alive and they laugh and they cry and they're human? He said, no, they've changed.
James Baker, was he the kind of guy who, it's been said, didn't work hard?
No, he was not the kind of guy who didn't work hard. I think that was a completely bum rap, and as a matter of fact, most people don't know this, but President Reagan wrote, usually in longhand, most of the letters that went out from the Oval Office before his secretary would type them up, rather than dictate them, because he wanted to take that kind of care. But the fact of the matter is, President Reagan was really quite a hard-working chief executive.
Could I say a word about that, Larry?
You sure can.
You know, I think Ronald Reagan was perhaps the most disciplined person I ever saw. He'd come down at 9 o'clock to the Oval Office. You could set your watch by it. He stayed there and worked all morning. He usually took lunch in his private little dining room next door to the Oval Office. He'd come back and work in the afternoon, and at 6 o'clock, he would go directly upstairs and work out on his Nautilus machines. And it was regular, it was routine, and it was very, very disciplined. He was a hard-working president.
Why, Michael Diva, was the image the other way? We'd hear about long naps and as Maureen says, a lot of vacations.
Gosh, I mean, I can't even tell you when Ronald Reagan took a long nap. I don't know why that is. I think part of it was that he was so comfortable all the time. Mm-hmm. I think people were looking for somebody to age or somebody to have deep furrows growing into his forehead. He was so comfortable. One of the other things people were talking about, I think Howard Baker was talking about how he knew who he was. One of the things he told me when I first met him 15 years before we ever got to the White House was that he said, Mike, you know, I was asking him to do something that he wasn't comfortable in doing for the press. And he said, you got to understand, if I'm not comfortable doing it, the people aren't going to be comfortable watching me do it. He said, you must understand the camera doesn't lie. And I thought that was a pretty good thing for a politician and a leader to understand.
Maureen, this attitude of easygoing, and that pervaded every area of his life?
Well, it was amazing. We knew how competitive he was, but it was very difficult for other people to see it because he always looked like the guy who would be just as happy to go home to the ranch. But it's just in the last 5 years that he stopped trying to beat us swimming the length of the swimming pool. He's just an incredibly competitive person. One thing that I wanted to add, and that is that he was the kind of executive and the kind of person who wanted to give credit to the people who came and served and who did all this wonderful work. And so he didn't bother to take credit for things that presidents usually take credit for. And I think because of that, it was assumed he didn't work very hard. And the other thing was, I think the nap thing came up because when he was recovering from being shot, there were several weeks in which the doctors made him go upstairs every afternoon. And of course, Sam Donaldson never saw a schedule after that, so he forgot that that was just for that short period of time.
Larry, you remember the sign that was on his desk in the Oval Office? There's no end to what a man can accomplish if he doesn't care who gets the credit.
Yeah.
And that was his philosophy.
And he always held to that. We'll be back with our remaining moments on this 87th birthday tribute to President Reagan after this. Maureen Reagan, do you think that attitude has helped him during this tragic disease?
I think that, yes, he always believed that there was a plan, that God had a plan for what he was supposed to do, and I think that has made him accepting of it when other people with the same disease have become much more frustrated than he has.
Marlon, what's his legacy to this nation?
Well, I think it's a great spirit that as I travel around the country, people love him more than ever because he represented the spirit of American optimism and goodness. He believed in the goodness of the American people, and they responded to it.
James Baker, what's the legacy of Ronald Reagan?
Well, I think Marlon said it pretty well. I think that is the legacy. He restored America's pride and confidence in itself, and he brought us prosperity, and by ending the Cold War, he brought us peace. Peace, prosperity, and pride.
Michael Deaver, is personality as important a part of this job as maybe policy?
I think personality is important. I think we look for characteristics and character in people. And Reagan understood that people saw that about him, saw that about our leaders. And here was a guy who basically loved everybody he ever met. And that came through, that kindness sometimes was even a fault, but that came through to the people, that this was a basically decent man who never, ever forgot his roots. He was, of all the people that like myself, who started out with him early in 1966, came all the way through the presidency, he was the only one of all of us that never changed.
Did you ever, Howard Baker, see him get wildly angry?
I saw him get pretty angry. Anytime that you would cross one of his fundamental beliefs, he was a very tranquil person, but if you were at cross purposes with what he really believed, he could assert himself pretty enthusiastically. Larry, let me tell you what I think his legacy is. I think everything that's been said so far is true, but I also think that he reestablished the image of the American presidency. He was he was absolutely a role model for American presidents, and I think people responded to that, appreciated that, and I think that is one of his great contributions.
Indeed, Helen Thomas, the jokes wouldn't work anymore, would they?
Not really, not at all. I think that his legacy will be that there was a Reagan Revolution. He did turn the country to the right. I think it's sort of moved back now to the center. But there's no question that he was tremendously influential in his era, and the country did move away, move toward the right. Very conservative, became much more conservative. And I think I'll remember President Reagan so much because I was amazed at his lack of ego. Maureen's probably right. He was very competitive, but he didn't have a big ego, nor was he ever arrogant.
Maureen, he wouldn't get up in the morning wondering if he's Time's Man of the Year, right?
No, that never bothered him. And I'll tell you something else. He used to sit upstairs at night, and we'd be there, and they would bring folders. As the gentlemen know, they just kept bringing folders, things to be read, things to be studied, things to be signed. And he'd finally finish it, and he'd say, "Oh, thank goodness the homework's done. Now can we go watch television for an hour?"
In fact, there was one night you were on our show early on, and he called into the control room just to say how proud he was of his daughter.
Yes.
You were on in some debate over some policy, and he was just proud that you were doing so well.
Well, he was always a great dad, and he still is. And we all miss him, and miss what we don't have of him anymore. But he's still the best.
Thank you all very much for participating in this hour, and thanks to the former presidents and current president for participating as well, and of course to Nancy Reagan. We're very happy to have been part of this 87th birthday tribute to Ronald Reagan. We're back Monday night on Larry King Live. Leon Panetta is the special guest. Next Tuesday, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Also next week, Eric Clapton. Have a great rest of the weekend and good night.